Hey everybody, I'm Zael Mednick, and welcome to another episode of Preconceived. The story of Titanic's sinking has captivated the hearts, minds, and curiosities of people around the world for over 100 years. The seemingly unthinkable happened. The unsinkable ship did sink. Not only did it sink, but it sunk on its much-anticipated maiden voyage. And with its sinking, over 1,500 people perished. The narrative often told is one of hubris. A ship heralding itself as unsinkable, ignores iceberg warnings, and doesn't even have enough lifeboats for all of its passengers. But is this a story of hubris? Were the decisions made in the building of Titanic and on the night Titanic sank any different than the decisions other shipliners and captains would have made? I'm joined today by Professor Stephanie Barczewski. A specialist in modern British history, Dr. Barczewski has been at Clemson since 1996. Her latest book is How the Country House Became English: Heroic Failure on the British, Country House and the British Empire, Antarctic Destinies, Scott Shackleton and the Changing Face of Heroism, and relevant to today's talk, Titanic, A Night Remembered. She's authored many other books and publications as well. She is currently researching the peculiarities of the British natural environment. All right, Professor Stephanie Barczewski, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Very excited to have you on this podcast. You were featured on another podcast about Titanic, a whole series on Noiser, which you said you haven't even listened to, but you were such a fantastic guest on that podcast. And you had such interesting insights combined with your historical knowledge of the event that I needed to have you here. And this is a topic that I've really wanted to do for so long. And Titanic, it's one of my favorite movies. I think it's an amazing movie. Some people might disagree and say that's too cliche, but I think it's fantastic. But that was kind of my introduction to Titanic. Why for you is this a topic that captivated you so much that you decided to write a book on it?
I think there's two things, and the movie is actually relevant. The first thing is that I was interested in 1912. There's not just I'm a British historian by academic specialty. And in 1912, there's not just the Titanic disaster in Britain. There's also a second disaster, which is the death of an explorer named Robert Falcon Scott, who dies on his way back from the South Pole. He becomes the second person to get to the South Pole. He's beaten to the South Pole by a Norwegian explorer named Roald Amundsen. And then Scott and four of his companions die on the way back. This might seem a long way from Titanic, but in fact it's not, because Scott dies and the Titanic sinks within about 2 weeks of each other in the spring of 1912. And I was interested in exploring the impact of kind of these two disasters on sort of British culture right before the First World War. Unfortunately, publishers were less interested in it than I was. They basically said to me, we don't think that's a very good idea, but hey, why don't you write a book on Titanic and a book on Captain Scott, two different books, and that's ultimately what I ended up doing. So it was a kind of roundabout way of getting interested in the story. But once I started thinking about Titanic, which is something that I had never really thought about before, just like you, it was around the time that the James Cameron film, right, was the biggest film in, the history of movies, basically. And, as a cultural historian, I was interested in thinking about why are so many people so captivated by this story, right? What is so fascinating about the Titanic story? Why is it that we keep retelling the story over and over again? I think whatever we want to argue about the merits of the Cameron movie, I actually like it as well. And I do think if you want to see what the Titanic actually looked like, it's the best you're going to get, right? It's the recreations of the ship are, with a few minor dramatic details, pretty accurate. But I think the Cameron movie also is a really interesting take on the Titanic myth, right? If we think of the Titanic myth as kind of women and children first. And when I say myth, I don't mean it's purely fiction, right? I just mean it's the kind of narrative story that we've evolved about the disaster that can have elements of both truth and fiction. And a big part of the Titanic myth is women and children first, right? And I think and also the class story as well, right? This idea that heroic first class men stepped aside so women and children from third class could get into lifeboats, which we probably mostly know is in part true and in part not true, right? And I think the film is very interesting how it plays with both the gender aspects of the Titanic story, right? So we do get like Kate Winslet's character, Rose Bukater, right? She is a sort of, feminist heroine in a way that is not typical of the way the Titanic story is told. But in the end, right, the conventional gender code does reassert itself, right? She survives and Jack famously doesn't, right? I mean, everybody gets frustrated because why can't Jack get on the piece of wood too?
Wasn't enough room.
Yeah, it just wasn't. He tried, right? And it was going to sink. So he sacrificed himself, which is a reassertion, right, of that traditional kind of Titanic gender code. And then the story is really aggressive, right, in taking on the kind of class myth. And so instead of the first class characters being the heroes of the story, the first class story, the hit characters are the villains of Cameron's film. And then the third class characters like Jack Dawson, right, become the real heroes of the story. So I think the Cameron film is really interesting in how it, retells the Titanic myth, maybe for a more modern audience, right? And has to deal with some of those kind of famous aspects of the story in a new way because it's telling the story in 1997, right, is the year of the film, not 1912. Um, so that was really how I came to it, right? Was first of all this roundabout way through thinking about polar exploration, really, and then secondly, once I got onto the Titanic story, thinking about why are people so fascinated by it.
A lot of the fascination, I think, comes down to this narrative that's been told, which I mentioned in the introduction, this idea. And it might be a preconception, it might be true, and that's one of the main things I wanna chat with you today about on this podcast. This idea that the Titanic was really this story of hubris, and it was touted as this unsinkable ship, and it really just got too cocky. Not enough lifeboats, went too fast, ignored glacier warnings, and ultimately, that the story of the Titanic is that it was so overconfident that it became irresponsible. As with most things, I think it's more nuanced than that, obviously, but that's certainly one of the compelling narratives and themes that gets people interested in the Titanic. Would you agree before we kind of break that down, that that is a narrative that certainly or that exists?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when we think about why is it such a powerful myth, the story of the Titanic, right? We have to take that into account that it is it's like the story, of it's like a classical myth, right? Of, someone flying too close to the sun and then getting knocked down for it. It's a story of kind of overreaching human arrogance, right? I'm not saying I think it's true. I think, again, it's in part true and in part not, but I'm sure we're going to talk about that. But it's I think the appeal of that, right, this idea that, when people get too big for their britches, then they get knocked down a peg or two, right? I think that is a big part of the appeal of the Titanic story. I think there's so many parts of the appeal of the Titanic story, right, that's part of why it's been such an enduring and powerful story. But I think that story of hubris is certainly one.
So, the way I kinda conceptualize this, and you're the expert, so you can tell me if this makes sense, is I look at it as I kind of wanna assess, were the decisions that were made in the preparation for the Titanic and on the night of the Titanic and after it sank, were those decisions that were reasonable at the time? And I look at it as the preparation for the voyage itself, and then kind of the handling of the crash. Maybe those aren't the best categories, but we'll go with those. In terms of the preparation of the voyage, the construction of the ship, up to 4 compartments famously could fill with water, and if more were breached, then it would sink, but that was kind of seen as unthinkable. Was this a unique design, and was this really considered quite a good design, and it was just crazy unlucky that that design didn't work?
Both, right? It's a good design. It's not a particularly, innovative or radical design, right? Lots of ships by 1912 had evolved the idea of having watertight compartments, right, separated by watertight bulkheads, walls, essentially, right, that could help to prevent a ship from sinking were it to be involved in a collision. Engineers basically thought about two types of collisions, right? They thought about that a ship could run head on into something, or they thought that another ship could run head on into it, right? And they thought they had kind of encompassed the full spectrum of what could possibly happen to a ship. And if you think about it, that's pretty good, right? I mean, if you think about, how accidents take place, you can either think, well, the ship's going to hit something or another ship's going to hit it. And so the Titanic was designed for that. It didn't have some of the features that it might have had that might have made it even safer or debatably not, right? So one thing it didn't have was it didn't have a transverse bulkhead, right? So that would be a bulkhead running down the spine of the ship essentially from bow to stern, right? That would mean that if one of those compartments got breached, it would only fill up on one side. Now that might sound great, right? That might sound like, oh, that would have stopped it from sinking, and maybe it would have in the Titanic's case, but that could also be a problem. That's part of what happened to the Lusitania, right? Was because it had a transverse bulkhead and the German torpedo hit it on one side of the ship. That side of the ship very much filled up with water, and it tilted over, which made it almost impossible for anybody to get off of that ship, right? So that was not a foolproof way. The thing that would have helped the Titanic most would have been had those watertight compartments been capped off with a watertight bulkhead at the top of them, right? And maybe some of your listeners have heard about this because the problem that happened is when the front compartment started to fill, then the bow of the ship was pulled down and the water started to spill over the top of those because they were open at the top, like an ice cube tray. We have to think about it, right? Not like a box, but like an ice cube tray. And the water spilled over the top of first one bulkhead and another all the way back, right, basically to the stern of the ship, and then eventually the entire ship was pulled under. So if they had capped off those watertight bulkheads at the top, then that might have saved the ship. But we have to remember that watertight bulkheads are a real pain when you're thinking about people having to move around the ship. And if you're talking about capping them off at the top, then you've got a bulkhead that's in a place where passengers and crew need to move around the ship. If you're way down at the bottom, it doesn't matter that much. But if you're up on B deck, which I think is where most of Titanic's bulkheads ended, I might be wrong about that. That's a part that people need to be able to move around the ship. And watertight bulkheads make that very, very difficult. And when you've got Titanic, a ship that's designed for comfort and luxury first and foremost, that's just not a great combination. And so there were rational reasons why they chose to design the safety features. And again, they thought by having it where those watertight compartments would be okay in the event of a head-on collision or be okay in the event of something running into the side of the ship, then they thought they had accounted for most possibilities. I think it's not unreasonable, right? We just sometimes get surprised, and we can probably all think in our minds of other disasters, right? I'll let the audience kind of imagine those other disasters where we thought we had, this couldn't possibly happen, and then we hadn't taken into account some alternative possibility. And I think that's sort of what happens to the Titanic.
What was it about the Titanic that led to I don't know if it was even the ship company that heralded it as unsinkable, but people heralding it as unsinkable? Was it based on any safety features, or it was just based on how large it was and this idea of it's such a great ship?
I think it was bad. It was never claimed by White Star, the owner of Titanic themselves. It was never claimed by anybody who built the ship or sailed the ship. Although, famously Captain Edward Smith of the Titanic did say in an interview some years before that, long before he was ever captain of the Titanic, so he was not speaking about the Titanic specifically, but he did say, I can't imagine a disaster that would cause a big ship to founder, to sink, right? He thought that maritime technology had gone past that point, right? There hadn't been a major maritime disaster in a very, very long time in 1912, so there was a certain degree of complacency. I mean, I think, whatever we wanna do with the kind of hubris side of the Titanic myth, and actually kinda cross the line from complacency into arrogance, I think we can't help but look at complacency as a factor. I'm not saying I think it's the primary factor. We can probably get into talking about, that a little bit more, but it was there because people sort of, there hadn't been a major maritime disaster for a long time. And people assumed the kind of maritime technology was able to, whatever the precise configuration of these watertight bulkheads, I don't think people were thinking, oh, it mattered, whether you had a transverse bulkhead or whether you had the bulkheads capped off. I think they thought the bulkheads themselves on most of these big ships were making them pretty foolproof. Now they're going to find out quite quickly that wasn't true, right? Because we're not only going to get the Titanic sinking, right? We're going to get the Empress of Ireland sinking in Canada, right? Which is another almost Titanic scale disaster. And we're going to get the Lusitania sinking, right? In 1915. We're going to get those all like bing, 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 right? In a row. So it's going to prove very quickly that these big ships are not invulnerable, and in fact, in some ways, their size and their safety configurations are making them actually a little bit more vulnerable in a way.
When the Titanic does hit, it's something that obviously wasn't anticipated in terms of that mechanism. You said that people thought, let's make this safe enough for these ships that it can hit another ship or that it can be hit by a ship. When it hits the glacier, just explain maybe what happened there and why was that something that I guess was it such a fluke that they never would have thought that a glacier would scrape it to that degree? Because when you're talking about the two obvious ways it could get hurt are by other ships, wouldn't they have thought about glaciers too?
They thought about icebergs, certainly.
Icebergs, sorry, icebergs.
That's okay. Fakes made of ice, right? So So they certainly thought about icebergs, right? Icebergs were a formidable danger to ships in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. They were aware in 1912 that it was a particularly bad year for ice. There was an unusually large number of icebergs. I think it had been kind of a warm winter, right, which had caused more icebergs to break off, right, from essentially the kind of Arctic coast, right? And these icebergs had drifted in large numbers into the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Everybody was aware of that in 1912. So icebergs were taken seriously, right? That's why the Titanic had, some of these watertight compartments. That's why they had lookouts looking out for icebergs, right? The famous cry when they see it, iceberg dead ahead. That's what they're looking for, right? They're not out there looking for whales or seals or walruses, right? They're looking for icebergs. So they took them very seriously. But it is also the case that the way that and the more I think about the Titanic story, the more I think about this, right? The way that the Titanic hits that iceberg, you couldn't have done it on purpose, right? If William Murdoch, who was in charge of the ship, right, the officer who was in charge of the ship at that fateful moment, right? If they had said to him, "Hit the iceberg in this way where it's gonna scrape along the side and it's gonna open this little slit," it's not even a continuous slit in the side of the ship, it's like dots and dashes, right? I mean, we just had I think it was National Geographic, right, just went down with some really high-tech, camera equipment and was able to actually, get I mean, it didn't tell us anything. I mean, these things are always presented to us as revelations about the Titanic, and it told us exactly what we already know, right? Some guy I forget whether it was the British or American, or right after the disaster, he calculated based on how fast the ship sank, the total size of the hole and the size of the ship. He calculated it to be about 12 square feet, which is the size of a door, basically. That's the total area of the Titanic that was open to the sea, right?
Wild.
Crazy, right? Completely crazy. It's small. It's a tiny hole considering how big that ship was. And it's not even one big hole, right? It's just these little things, process.
This long gash.
Well, it's not even a long gash. It's like a series of short gashes. I think is
Mm.
probably the more accurate way to think about it. But the fateful thing about it, right, is that they extend into 6 compartments, right? And you've already mentioned that it could only float with 4 of the first compartments with 4 of the compartments breached, and so once it got to the 6th one, it was inevitable, right? So, Murdoch couldn't have he couldn't have done that if he tried, right? I mean, they could have given him a million tests, right? And they would have said, "Try to hit the ship in this way that's gonna open this," and you couldn't have done it, and I think that's a really important part of the Titanic story. We can talk about who's at fault, we can talk about complacency, we can talk about hubris and arrogance, we can talk about faulty design, but it's still just such colossal bad luck at the end of the day. They could have hit that iceberg in any other way, right? I mean, they could have smacked into it, and if they smacked into it, he probably would have killed 100, 200 people in the bow of the ship, right? But the ship would have survived, but that's not a decision Murdoch can make, right? If he sees any chance to get around it, he's gonna try to get around it, and this is where we come back to, too, the size of the ship, right? That we have to remember that it's big. No one's really used to maneuvering a ship that big. There's always been some discussion about the Titanic that the rudder was too small for the ship. Maybe, right? It doesn't turn well, for sure. He also does, I think, what anybody sane would have done, which is he tries to reverse the engines to slow the ship down, right, to buy himself a little bit more time to try to get around the iceberg. But when he does that, he burbles the water around the rudder, and that makes it even harder because the rudder can't get good purchase in the water to turn, right? It's like a car trying to turn on ice or oily spot or something, right? It can't get grip there. So, he's making, I think, rational decisions in that fateful moment, but all of those decisions add up to just this colossal piece of bad luck that he hits the iceberg. He doesn't do it, the ship does it. The ship hits the iceberg in this just the worst possible way. I mean, if he'd hit it, I suspect if there had just been a few feet of difference, right, he would have missed it entirely, or he would have hit it so hard that it would have opened a bigger hole, but in a smaller part of the ship, if that makes sense. I mean, the ship could have withstood a giant hole in 1 or 2 compartments, that would have been perfectly fine. And I think that's such a key part of the story, and we often don't really think about that, right? Just what a
And like
colossal bad luck that was.
and like you said, if he hit it straight on, maybe 150 people would have died, but that's not a decision anybody would have made, and he would have been fired immediately for that decision. 'Cause nobody could have predicted that this would have happened by making the decision he made.
Yeah, I mean, who knows, but I suspect you're right. I mean, I suspect it would have been said, "Hey, like, the ship, could have probably survived either way, so why didn't you try to get around it?" Right? I mean, there just would have been no if it hadn't happened, we probably wouldn't have any idea that that type of collision to a ship could happen, right? I mean, I don't maybe there is another one. I mean, people who are more I'm a cultural historian, not a maritime historian, and there may be other maritime historians who could say there's an example of another ship having a collision with an iceberg in that way, where it just scrapes along the side and kind of opens a cut in the side of the ship. But I don't know of one, right? It's a really hard thing to do if you think about it.